My mother-in-law, the woman who spent 3 years telling anyone who would listen that I was a gold digger, just called to ask me for an extension on her rent. The irony is so thick, I could choke on it. Most days, my hands are steady. They have to be. In my world, the world of beeping heart monitors and the sterile, cold weight of a scalpel, a tremor can be the difference between life and death. To my colleagues at Chicago General, I'm Dr. Fisher. Composed, precise, in control. They see the woman who can piece together a failing heart, but they have no idea how easily mine was almost shattered. They don't know about the family dinners, where my accomplishments were dismissed with a tight smile, or the passive-aggressive comments about how lucky my husband, Daniel, was to have a wife who could afford, well, everything. They don't know that for years, my name was dragged through the mud in whispers I was never meant to hear, that the woman who raised the man I love painted me as a manipulative leech, out to steal a family inheritance that, frankly, I never even wanted. You're probably wondering how we got here. How the woman who wore a white dress to my wedding now lives in a house that I own, a house I saved from foreclosure just to prove a point. It wasn't a single event. It was a slow burn, a war of 1,000 paper cuts. And then came the final, devastating lie that forced me to stop healing others and finally save myself. This story is a lot. It's about betrayal, but it's also about finding a strength you never knew you had. If you want to hear how it all unfolded, how I turned the tables on the woman who tried to ruin me, then stick with me. This is a long and painful story, and I'll need a friend to see it through. Be sure to follow along so you don't miss what's coming next. When I met Daniel, it was at a stuffy faculty mixer for the university hospital. I was a resident, running on caffeine and 4 hours of sleep, and he was. A breath of fresh air. He wasn't a doctor or a surgeon trying to one-up everyone in the room. He was a high school history teacher, and his eyes lit up when he talked about the fall of Rome, in a way I'd only ever seen in an operating room when a difficult procedure went perfectly right. He was funny and kind, and he didn't seem to care that my schedule was a nightmare or that I made significantly more money than he did. With him, I wasn't Dr. Fisher. I was just Lauren. We fell hard and fast. I remember the drive to his mother's house for the first time. It was a Sunday afternoon in the fall, the kind where the air is crisp and smells like wood smoke. I was nervous, twisting the ring on my finger. I wanted her to like me. It was important to Daniel, and so it was important to me. He was an only child, and his father had passed away years ago. He always spoke of his mom, Patricia, with this deep, unwavering reverence. "She's my rock," he'd say, and I wanted to be part of that foundation. Her house was in a quiet, manicured suburb, perfect lawn, gleaming windows. It screamed old money, but in a subtle, understated way. The moment she opened the door, I felt it, a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Patricia was perfectly put together, impeccable blonde hair, a silk blouse, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She smelled of expensive perfume, something sharp and floral. "So, you're the famous Lauren," she said, her voice smooth as glass. Her eyes did a quick, professional scan from my shoes to my earrings, like she was appraising livestock. Dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. She'd ask me about my work, but frame it as a curiosity. "It must be so demanding," she said, letting the word hang in the air. "I can't imagine having a career that leaves so little time for family. It's wonderful that Daniel is so flexible." I tried to explain that I loved my job, that the long hours were worth it. Daniel, bless his heart, jumped in to praise my latest publication in a medical journal. Patricia just smiled that tight smile again. Of course. How? Ambitious. Daniel didn't seem to notice the undertone. He was so happy to have his two favorite women in the same room that he was blind to the tension. He'd laugh at a story she told about his childhood, completely missing the sideways glance she shot my way. On the drive home, he was buzzing. "See, I told you she'd love you," he said, squeezing my hand. I wanted to believe him. I really did, but my gut was screaming. And then came the twist. The little crack in the facade. "You know, it's funny," Daniel said, his eyes on the road. "When you went to the bathroom after dinner, Mom told me she was worried about you." My stomach tightened. Worried about what? "She said she can see how much pressure you're under. She thinks I should encourage you too. I don't know, maybe cut back on your hours. She said, a woman's health is so fragile and that I need to make sure I'm taking care of you." He smiled, looking over at me. "She's just being a mom, you know? Always protective." My blood ran cold. The silence in the car was suddenly deafening. That wasn't concern I'd heard in her voice all night. It was judgment, disapproval. She hadn't said she was worried about me. She'd implied I was neglecting him. She was twisting my success into a weakness, painting herself as the caring matriarch while positioning me as a selfish career woman. And she was doing it right in front of Daniel, in a way he would interpret as love. He had heard concern, I had heard a warning. And as I sat there in the dark, the warmth of his hand suddenly feeling miles away, I knew this was just the beginning. I was looking at the first tiny fracture in the life I was trying to build, and I had a sinking feeling it was about to spread. The years between that first dinner and the day I finally broke were a blur of forced smiles and gritted teeth. Daniel and I got engaged, and that's when Patricia's subtle campaign escalated into open warfare. She wasn't just dropping hints anymore. She was building walls. She criticized every choice for the wedding. The venue was a bit much for a teacher's salary, a clear dig that I was the one paying. My dress was rather ostentatious, and when I tried to include Daniel in the planning, she'd pull him aside for a quick word, and he'd come back looking stressed, suggesting we go with a cheaper option his mother had found. It was exhausting. I felt like I was constantly fighting a ghost. The worst part was the prenuptial agreement. It was her idea, of course. She cornered me one afternoon when I dropped by to pick up Daniel. She set me down in her pristine living room, the air thick with that sharp floral perfume, and handed me a cup of tea I didn't want. She told me, with a voice dripping in false concern, that she thought a prenup was a modern and sensible way to start a marriage. She said it wasn't about a lack of trust in me, of course, but about protecting Daniel's legacy. The inheritance his father had left, she spoke about it like it was the crown jewels. I was stunned into silence. It felt like a slap in the face. I looked at Daniel, hoping he'd shut it down, but he just looked uncomfortable. Caught between the two of us, he said his mom had a point, that it was just a piece of paper and it would make her feel better. He didn't see the accusation behind her words. He just saw a way to keep the peace. So I agreed. I sat in a lawyer's office, my own heart the organ I knew so intimately pounding in my ears, and signed a document that basically said in a dozen different legal clauses that I was not entitled to a single dime of the Reed family money. I signed it to prove to her, and maybe even a little to myself, that she was wrong about me. I signed it, and I saw a flicker of triumphant satisfaction in her eyes. But the real turning point, the moment that shifted me from passive endurance to active investigation, came about a year into our marriage. Daniel's cousin, a sweet girl named Chloe, cornered me at a family barbecue. She looked genuinely confused. She asked me, in a hushed voice, if it was true that I'd made Daniel sell some of his father's stocks to pay for our new home in Lincoln Park. The hamburger I was about to eat felt like a rock in my hand. I stared at her. What? No, of course not. I bought the house. Chloe's eyes widened. Oh, well, Patricia told my mom that you had? Very expensive taste. And Daniel was struggling to keep up. She said he was heartbroken to have to part with his father's portfolio. The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was outright, malicious lies. Fabricated stories designed to paint me as a villain. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Patricia's smug face, her carefully crafted words twisting reality, it was a poison seeping into every part of my life. I realized then that I couldn't just defend myself anymore. I had to understand the enemy. I had to know what I was really up against. My chance came a few weeks later. Daniel's birthday was approaching, and I wanted to do something special. I decided to create a beautiful, bound photo book of his life, from childhood to now. I told him I needed to rate his mother's old albums for baby pictures. It was the perfect excuse. I went over on a Tuesday afternoon when I knew she'd be at her weekly book club. She left a key for me under the mat, telling me the albums were in the attic. The attic was dusty and smelled of cedar and forgotten things. Boxes were stacked everywhere, labeled in Patricia's neat, controlled handwriting. Daniel, school projects, Christmas ornaments, family heirlooms. I found the photo albums easily enough, but my gut told me to look further. I wasn't just there for photos anymore. I was searching for a truth I wasn't even sure I wanted to find. In the corner, under an old linen sheet, was a heavy, wooden chest. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside were old tax documents, Daniel's father's old work files, and beneath them, a collection of personal letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. My hands were trembling as I untied it. Most were love letters between his parents. But one, in a different envelope, caught my eye. It was addressed to Patricia's sister, postmarked just a week after I met Daniel for the first time. My breath hitched. I unfolded the thin, crinkled paper. Patricia's handwriting was unmistakable. The letter started with pleasantries about her garden and the book club, but then it shifted. Daniel has a new girlfriend, she wrote. A heart surgeon, if you can believe it. Very ambitious. Drives a German car, he's completely smitten. Of course. He sees a brilliant, successful woman. I see a mountain of student debt and a lifestyle that our Daniel could never support on a teacher's salary. She seems nice enough on the surface, but I know her type. They see a good, stable man from a family with a comfortable nest egg, and they pounce. Mark my words, I'll have to handle this delicately. I've already spoken to George about drafting a prenuptial agreement, just in case this gets serious. I won't let her get her hands on what his father worked so hard to build. The papers shook in my hands. The air in the attic was suddenly too thin to breathe. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't overprotectiveness. It was a calculated, premeditated judgment. From the moment she laid eyes on me, she had seen me as a threat, a caricature, a type. She hadn't been getting to know me. She had been building a case against me. And as I stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of a family I so desperately wanted to be a part of, I realized the woman I had been trying to win over for 3 years didn't exist. In her place was a cold, calculating strategist who had declared war on me before I even knew we were on a battlefield. After finding that letter in the attic, my world split into two realities. In one, I was still Lauren, the loving wife, the dedicated surgeon. I went to work, I kissed Daniel good morning, I sat through Sunday dinners at Patricia's house and complimented her overcooked pot roast. Smiling at her felt like a full-time job, one that drained me more than a 12-hour surgery. In the other reality, I was a detective in my own life. Every word she said was evidence. Every question she asked was a potential trap. I was constantly on guard, analyzing, dissecting, searching for the truth I now knew she was hiding. I'd catch her watching me from across the room with a look that wasn't motherly concern, but cold, hard assessment. She was sizing me up, waiting for me to make a mistake. The real discovery, the one that showed me just how deep the rot went, happened because of something completely mundane. Our taxes. Daniel, bless his heart, is brilliant with history, but a complete disaster with finances. He'd always let his mother handle his tax preparation before we were married. This year, I insisted we hire a professional accountant. I told him it was because our finances were more complicated now that we were married and owned a home. That was true, but the real reason was that I wanted a neutral third party to have a look at everything. To get Patricia's influence out of our financial life for good, our accountant asked for all our previous year's tax returns, bank statements, and any records of outstanding debts. Daniel just handed me a dusty accordion file from his closet. "It's all in there," he said with a shrug, trusting me completely. I spent a Saturday afternoon in our home office, the scent of coffee growing cold beside me, sifting through years of paperwork. It was mostly what I expected. His teaching salary stubs, student loan statements, the usual. But then I found something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Tucked into the file for the year before we were married was a confirmation letter for a credit inquiry from a bank I'd never heard of. It was dated just a few months after our engagement. I frowned. We hadn't been applying for any loans then. I remembered Daniel mentioning he had to replace his car around that time, but he'd said he used his savings. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. It was just a small thing, an anomaly. But in my line of work, you learn that the smallest anomalies are often the first sign of a much bigger disease. That night, after Daniel was asleep, I went back into the office and closed the door. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type. I used Daniel's information with a surge of guilt that was quickly replaced by grim necessity to pull his full credit report. I told myself it was for his own protection. The page loaded, a sterile, black and white document that was about to drain all the color from my world. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the list of accounts, and then I saw them. It wasn't just one credit card, it was 3, all opened in his name within the last 3 years. One from the bank on the inquiry letter, to others I didn't recognize. Then, a personal loan for $40,000. The mailing address listed for every single account was not our address. It was Patricia Reed's. My breath caught in my throat. The numbers swam before my eyes. I pulled out a calculator, my fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. The total debt accumulated in my husband's name, without his knowledge, was over $120,000. A wave of nausea washed over me so intensely I had to grip the edge of the desk. This wasn't just gossip. This wasn't just a mother's misguided protection. This was calculated. Criminal fraud. She hadn't just been poisoning our family against me. She had been actively stealing from her own son. And in that horrifying moment, it all clicked into place with a sickening snap. The lies about me being a gold digger, the stories about me forcing Daniel to sell stocks, it was a smokescreen. It was a preemptive strike. She was creating a narrative so that if Daniel ever discovered this mountain of debt, he wouldn't look at her. He'd look at me. She had been building a case against me from day one, not to protect his inheritance, but to cover up the fact that she was the one draining his finances, destroying his credit, and saddling him with a secret burden that could have ruined him. I leaned back in my chair, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The woman who claimed to love her son more than anything in the world was willing to sacrifice his future to fuel her own lifestyle. The grief I felt was immense for Daniel, for the trust that had been so grotesquely violated. But as the minutes ticked by, the sadness began to curdle, hardening into something else. It was a cold, sharp, righteous anger. This wasn't just about my reputation anymore. This was about protecting the man I loved from the person he trusted most. The tears that had threatened to fall dried up. The time for being hurt was over. Now, it was time to fight. Knowing the truth was one thing. Living with it was another. For the next 2 weeks, I became the finest actress Chicago General had ever seen. The operating room was my only refuge, the one place where the world narrowed to a single beating heart and a problem I knew how to fix. Outside of it, I was performing. I had to move through my life, through my own home, with a mask of placid normalcy fused to my face. Every time Daniel mentioned his mother, every time her name flashed on his phone, I had to fight the urge to scream. I had to smile, nod, and pretend I didn't know that the woman he idolized was systematically destroying his future. My anger had cooled from a raging fire into something much more dangerous, a block of ice. It was cold, hard, and sharp. I knew a direct confrontation would be a disaster. Patricia would deny everything, paint me as a hysterical, paranoid wife, and Daniel, who was conditioned for a lifetime to believe her, would be torn apart. I couldn't do that to him. I had to give her the rope, and I had to let her hang herself with it. So I did something that went against every instinct I had. I called her. "Patricia," I said, my voice carefully pitched to sound warm and friendly. I was thinking, we haven't had any time, just the two of us, in ages. I'd love to take you to lunch next week. My treat. There was a beat of surprised silence on the other end. Then, her voice, dripping with suspicion, that quickly melted into saccharine sweetness. She told me that was a lovely idea and suggested a ridiculously expensive French bistro downtown that she knew I could afford. Perfect. The day of the lunch, I chose my outfit like a suit of armor. A simple, elegant navy dress. Professional, non-threatening. I met her at the restaurant, the scent of her perfume hitting me like a physical blow. She was glowing, clearly pleased with this turn of events. She must have thought her campaign of whispers and lies had finally worked, that I was finally coming to her, hat in hand, seeking her approval. We made small talk over ridiculously small portions of food. I asked about her book club, her garden. I let her talk, nodding and smiling, my own plate of food tasting like ash in my mouth. My heart was beating a steady surgical rhythm in my chest, controlled, deliberate. I was observing her, looking for a crack, an opening. It came, as I knew it would. When the conversation turned to money, she started by lamenting the rising cost of living, how hard it was for a widow on a fixed income to maintain a house like hers. She sighed dramatically, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a heavy linen napkin. She told me how worried she was about Daniel, about his modest teacher's salary. And then she leaned forward, her voice dropping into a confidential whisper. She had the nerve to tell me how wonderful it was that Daniel had found someone like me, someone financially secure. She said it took a lot of pressure off him. I just nodded, my mask firmly in place. My apparent sympathy must have made her careless. She saw the compliant daughter-in-law she'd always wanted me to be. She saw a fool. You know, she continued, swirling the wine in her glass. Daniel is just like his father. So brilliant with people, but completely hopeless with numbers. He's just so trusting. She looked me right in the eye. He would sign anything I put in front of him. Bless his sweetheart. It's a good thing he has us to look out for him. My blood turned to ice. There it was. Not just an admission of his vulnerability, but a statement of her intent to exploit it. She wasn't done. She started talking about some unfortunate investments she'd made, blaming a bad financial advisor. She spoke of needing to restructure some things. She mentioned the term family loan consolidation, and how it would be so much simpler if everything was just bundled together under one name. It would be so much easier for me, she added with a sickeningly sweet smile, to help them manage the payments from a single account. I just sat there, my mind racing, connecting the dots with horrifying clarity. This was her endgame. She wasn't just running up debt in his name. She was planning to trick him into legally absorbing all of her bad investments, her secret losses, into one massive pile of debt. And then she would expect my income, the very thing she resented me for, to be the solution that would bail her out. She would ruin her son to save herself, and she'd do it with a smile. I kept my expression neutral, sympathetic even. I told her it sounded very stressful, and that I was sure she and Daniel would figure it out. As I drove home from that lunch, the facade finally cracked. I pulled over to the side of the road, the sounds of the city muted through the glass. My hands were shaking. She thought she had been confiding in a weak, pliable fool she had finally broken. But she hadn't. She had been confessing to the one person who could stop her. She hadn't just shown me her cards. She had handed me the entire deck. And in her arrogance, she'd given me the one thing I needed most, the blueprint for her own destruction. Walking out of that bistro, I felt like I had been submerged in ice water. The world seemed sharper, colors more vivid, sounds more distinct. The mask I had been wearing didn't just crack. It shattered. I finally understood how she was using Daniel's blind trust to manipulate him. I understood the what fraud on a massive scale, but the one piece that still gnawed at me, the question that kept me up at night staring at the ceiling, was the why. The numbers didn't add up. $120,000 was a huge amount of debt, far more than what was needed to maintain her comfortable suburban lifestyle. It wasn't just a few new outfits or a fancy vacation. This was something bigger, a desperation that felt primal. To risk her son's entire future, to commit a crime that could send her to prison, it had to be for a reason that went beyond simple greed. Understanding her motive wasn't about sympathy. It was about strategy. To win a war, you have to understand what your enemy is fighting for. I knew I couldn't find the answer in old letters or by confronting her. I was a surgeon, trained to find and fix problems within the human body. This was a sickness I didn't have the tools to diagnose. So I did something I never thought I would do. I crossed a line. The next day, I took a long lunch and drove to a nondescript office building downtown. The sign on the door was simple: Davies Investigations. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I was protecting my husband, my marriage, and my sanity. I walked in. The private investigator, Mr. Davies, was a man in his late 50s with tired eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of human ugliness. He didn't ask too many questions. He just listened, his face impassive, as I laid out the bare bones of the story, careful to omit the emotional details. I told him I suspected my mother-in-law had significant, undisclosed financial problems and was potentially involving her son without his consent. I wanted to know the full extent of her financial situation. I wrote him a check that made my hand tremble, and with that, my secret war became official. The week I waited for his call was the longest of my life. Every ping of my phone made my heart leap into my throat. At work, I was on autopilot, my hands moving with muscle memory while my mind was a million miles away. I felt a constant low-grade hum of guilt and anxiety. I was investigating my husband's mother, the woman he thought was a saint. It felt like a profound betrayal, but the alternative, letting her destroy him, was unthinkable. Finally, Mr. Davies called Dr. 20. Fisher, he said, his voice flat. I think you should come in. There are some things you need to see. His office was exactly as I'd left it, but the folder he placed on the desk between us felt 100 pounds heavier. He opened it, and the illusion of Patricia Reed, wealthy widow of a successful businessman, was systematically dismantled, document by document. The first was a public record of bankruptcy filed 15 years ago, a year before Daniel's father died of a heart attack. His successful construction business had collapsed under a mountain of debt. Mr. Davies explained that his death likely saved the family from public ruin, as the creditors were less aggressive with the grieving widow. The next document was the deed to her house. It was covered in liens. She had remortgaged it 3 times, pulling out every last cent of equity. The comfortable nest egg she was so obsessed with protecting didn't exist. It was a myth. It had been gone for over a decade. My breath hitched. My entire understanding of her was built on a lie. Then came the final devastating blow. Mr. Davies slid a printout of a news article from a local suburban paper, dated 12 years ago. The headline was small: Local investment group accused of Ponzi scheme. He pointed to a name on the list of victims who had lost everything: Patricia Reed. She hadn't just inherited debt from her husband. She had lost what little she had left, trying to win it all back in a risky, fraudulent scheme. It all became so clear, so painfully, pathetically clear. Patricia wasn't a wealthy woman pretending to be a victim. She was a broke woman, terrified of being exposed. Her entire life was a performance. The expensive car was leased. The country club membership was paid for with a high-interest credit card. The clothes, the lunches, the perfect home, it was all a house of cards, built on a foundation of secret loans and maxed-out credit, all taken out in her trusting son's name. The attacks on me, the gold digger narrative, it was never about me. It was about her own profound shame. I wasn't a threat to her son's inheritance, I was a threat to her lies. My genuine success was a constant, glaring spotlight on her fraudulent existence. She hated me because I was everything she was pretending to be. I sat there, staring at the papers, and I felt a strange, cold wave of, not pity, but understanding. Her deepest, darkest fear wasn't poverty. It was exposure. It was the humiliation of her friends, her family, her entire social circle finding out that she was a failure. And in that moment, in that sterile, quiet office, I realized I hadn't just discovered her motivation. I had found her weakness. I had found my weapon. I walked around with that folder from Mr. Davies' office for 3 days. Not the physical folder, but the weight of it. It lived in the locked bottom drawer of my desk, but I felt it in my chest with every breath. The truth was a toxic substance, and keeping it from Daniel felt like poisoning our marriage from the inside out. A chasm was opening between us, silent and deep. He'd come home from school, exhausted and smelling of chalk dust and cheap coffee, and tell me a funny story about one of his students. I'd smile and laugh, but my mind would be screaming. Your mother is a con artist who has saddled you with a 6-figure debt and has been planning your financial ruin for years. The disconnect was so jarring it made me physically ill. He could feel it too. He didn't know what it was, but he knew something was wrong. He'd get this worried look in his eyes and ask if I was okay, if work was getting to me. You seem distant, he said one night, as we were brushing our teeth before bed, his voice soft. I just blamed it on a difficult case, a long surgery. The lies were piling up, each one a brick in the wall I was building between us. I knew I couldn't keep it up. The secret was too heavy for one person to carry. I had the ammunition, the weapon, but I realized I couldn't fire it alone. The most decisive resource I could ever have wasn't a pie or a lawyer. It was my husband. But securing him meant risking everything. It meant telling him a truth that could shatter the very foundation of who he was. The breaking point came on a Thursday night. I was in the kitchen, trying to focus on chopping vegetables for a salad, when Daniel's phone rang. I saw the screen light up. Mom. He answered with that warm, open tone he only ever used with her. Hey Mom, how are you? I couldn't hear her side of the conversation, but I could see the effect of her words on his face. His smile tightened, his shoulders slumped. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit. He kept saying things like, no, of course not, don't worry about it, and yeah, I can probably move some things around. When he hung up, he looked pale and stressed. Everything okay? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. He let out a long, weary sigh. Yeah, it's fine. Mom's just having some trouble with the roof. A leak. The estimate is insane. She was worried about paying for it. He tried to force a smile. She was so apologetic, said she hated to even ask, but wondered if I could help her out with a few thousand. I told her we'd figure it out. My knife stopped mid-chop, the blade resting on the cutting board. My knuckles were white, a few thousand. Just another drop in the ocean of debt she was creating, and the performance. The apology, the reluctance, it was all part of the act. She was bleeding him dry, and he thought he was saving her. That was it. I couldn't watch it happen anymore. I couldn't stand by while she played him like a fiddle. The risk of him hating me was suddenly less terrifying than the certainty of her destroying him. I put the knife down, wiped my hands on a towel, and looked at him. My heart was a trapped bird beating against my ribs. Daniel, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. We need to talk. Not here, in the office. And I need you to promise me you'll hear me out completely before you say a single word. The look on his face was a mixture of confusion and fear, but he saw the gravity in my eyes and just nodded. In the office, I closed the door. The silence was absolute. I sat down at my desk, and he took the chair opposite me. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out the file I had prepared. It wasn't Mr. Davies' file, it was my own. I had printed everything, organized it into a timeline. I started slowly, my voice low and even. I told him about the first dinner, about the feeling of being judged. I told him about the wedding planning, the constant little digs that made me feel like an intruder. I told him about the prenup, how it was her idea, how it was designed to isolate me. His face was a mask of confusion. He started to interrupt, to defend her, but I held up a hand. You promised, I said softly. I continued. I told him about Chloe's comment at the barbecue, the lie about me forcing him to sell stocks. I saw the first flicker of pained recognition in his eyes. He remembered that fight, how his mother had planted that seed. Then, I told him about going to the attic for the baby pictures. And I told him about the letter. I had made a copy. I pushed it across the desk. He read it, his brow furrowed. I watched his expression shift as he read the words she had written about me right at the very beginning. I know her type. I won't let her get her hands on what his father worked so hard to build. He looked up at me, his eyes clouded. Lauren, this is awful. I had no idea she felt this way. But she was just being protective. I thought so too, I said, my voice cracking slightly. For a long time, that's what I told myself. But it's more than that. Then, I turned the page. I showed him the credit report. I pointed to the accounts, one by one, the credit cards, the personal loan. The total amount, circled in red at the bottom, $122,450. I showed him the statements, the ones I'd had Mr. Davies' retrieve, all mailed to her address. He stared at the paper, his face draining of all color. He shook his head slowly, a silent, desperate denial. No, he whispered. No, this is a mistake. It has to be a mistake. Identity theft? Maybe? Someone stole my information. The first account was opened 3 months after we were engaged. Daniel, I said gently, right after I signed the prenup saying I couldn't touch your family's money, the mailing address on every single one of these accounts is your mother's house. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He started pacing, his hands on his head. No, she wouldn't. You don't understand my mother, Lauren. She would do anything for me. She wouldn't do this. He turned to me, his eyes flashing with a desperate defensive anger. Why were you doing this? Why were you digging into all of this? Did you hire someone to investigate my mother? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and painful. This was the moment it could all fall apart. I met his gaze, my own eyes filling with tears I refused to let fall. Yes, I said, my voice clear and strong. I did, because I was being painted as a villain in my own life, and I needed to know why. I did it because I saw you stressing about money you didn't know you owed. I did it because your mother was telling you she needed a few thousand for a roof leak, while she's holding over $100,000 of debt in your name. I did it to protect you. I did it to protect us. He stared at me, his anger warring with the horrifying evidence on the desk. He was breathing heavily, his whole world tilting. He looked down at the papers again, then back at me, his expression lost. And then I gave him the final, irrefutable piece. The truth that went beyond numbers and into motive. I told him about his father's business, the bankruptcy. I told him about the Ponzi scheme. I told him the inheritance he thought he was protecting didn't exist, that it had been gone for years, that his mother wasn't protecting a legacy. She was hiding a lie, a lifetime of failure and shame. That's what finally broke him. He sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a profound, hollow stillness. The sound of his own sharp inhale was the only thing that broke the silence. He didn't cry. It was something worse. It was the look of a man whose entire past had just been rewritten into a tragic novel of deceit. The hero of his story, his rock, was the villain. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the wall. Finally, he looked at me. The anger was gone. The denial was gone. All that was left was a deep, soul-crushing sadness, and beneath it, a tiny, hard glint of resolve. "What she told me on the phone," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "She said if I couldn't help, she'd have to consider selling the house." And I knew he understood. It was a threat, a manipulation to get more money. He reached across the desk and put his hand on top of mine. His skin was cold. "Okay," he said, his voice barely audible but firm. "What do we do?" And I knew I had him. The resource was secured. The alliance was formed. We were a team, and now the game could finally begin. The days after the truth came out were a new kind of hell. Our house, which had always been a sanctuary, became a library of grief. Silence was the new language Daniel and I spoke. He'd sit in his armchair for hours, the folder of evidence open on his lap, just staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. He was slowly, painfully beginning to understand. He didn't go to work for 2 days. He'd just traced the lines of his mother's signature on the loan applications. His expression, hollow. He told me it felt like his entire childhood was a lie, a carefully constructed set for a play he didn't know he was in. He'd look at old family photos on the mantelpiece, a smiling woman with her arm around her young son, and I could see him trying to reconcile that image with the one in the folder. He wasn't just mourning the mother he had. He was mourning the one he thought he had. I gave him his space. I didn't push or prod. I just made sure there was coffee in the pot and a plate of food he would barely touch. I knew this was a wound no surgery could fix. It had to heal on its own timeline. The turning point, the moment his grief began to calcify into resolve, came about a week later. He was in the kitchen when his phone rang. I saw her name and my entire body tensed. He hesitated, then answered, putting the call on speaker for me to hear. It was a masterclass in manipulation. I listened to her voice, thick with manufactured tears, weaving a sob story about how her car had broken down and the repair bill was astronomical. She never asked for money directly. She was too clever for that. She just lamented how she didn't know what she was going to do, how she felt so alone, how she wished his father were still here. It was a script designed to trigger his every protective instinct. But this time, something was different. I watched Daniel's face. The pained, conflicted son was gone. In his place was a man listening to a stranger. He heard the performance, the carefully chosen words, the emotional puppetry. When he hung up, the look in his eyes was cold. He told me he finally understood. It wasn't about love. It was about an objective. That night, we stopped being victims and started being strategists. We sat at our dining room table, the files spread between us like a battle map. We couldn't just confront her. A shouting match would solve nothing. She would lie, she would cry, she would twist it all back on me. We didn't just need to expose the truth. We needed leverage. We needed to dismantle the entire fraudulent world she had built for herself, piece by piece, until she had nowhere left to hide. The idea came to me in the dead of night, so audacious and so perfect that it took my breath away. Her power, her social standing, her entire identity was tied up in that pristine house in that manicured suburb. It was the stage for her performance. If we took the stage away, the actress would have nowhere to perform. A few days later, a certified letter arrived for her, a notice of foreclosure. Mr. Davies had alerted me it was coming. The remortgages, the liens, the house of cards was finally collapsing on its own. Patricia called Daniel, hysterical. He played his part perfectly, a concerned son promising to look into it, to see what could be done. This was our moment. This was the when. The where would be the house itself. I spent the next 2 weeks in a whirlwind of legal and financial maneuvers that felt more like a covert operation than a real estate transaction. I met with my lawyer, Ruth Martinez, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who looked at the evidence against Patricia with a grim, professional satisfaction. On her advice, I didn't just pay off the debts. That would have been a gift. Instead, I bought them. I became the primary creditor. And when the house went to a foreclosure auction on the courthouse steps, there was only one serious bidder. Me. The day the deed was signed, the cold weight of the keys in my hand felt definitive. I owned my mother-in-law's life. The thought sent a chill down my spine that was equal parts terrifying and exhilarating. Daniel was the one who went to see her. I couldn't. My presence would have been too inflammatory. He went with the papers, framing it as our last-ditch effort to save her. He told her we had pulled together everything we had to buy the house so she wouldn't be thrown out on the street. He told her we couldn't afford to just give it to her, but that she could stay. All she had to do was pay us a modest rent, far below the market rate. A simple formality to help us cover the taxes and upkeep. She had no choice. To refuse would be to admit defeat, to have her failure broadcast to the entire world. Her pride was the cage, and Daniel had just locked the door. I can only imagine the bitter taste in her mouth as she signed that lease agreement, the pen scratching her signature onto a document that made her a tenant in her own home, a tenant to the woman she called a gold digger. We had done it. We had created the perfect trap. It was no longer a question of if she would fail, but when. Her entire life was a testament to her inability to live within her means. We knew she wouldn't be able to keep up the payments. We knew her pride would never allow her to admit she needed help. All we had to do was wait for the 90-day delinquency clause in the lease agreement to kick in. The first month, the check arrived on time. The second, it was a week late, with a flurry of excuses. The third month, it didn't come at all. My messages went unanswered. My calls went to voicemail. The 90 days were up. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of Patricia Reed's Life of Lies, and I was going to be the one directing the show. The night before she was due to arrive was the quietest I've ever known. The city of Chicago, a beast that usually roared outside her windows, seemed to be holding its breath. Daniel was asleep, or pretending to be. His breathing was too even, too controlled. I knew he was staring into the same darkness I was, replaying the last 3 years in his mind, just as I was. I slipped out of bed and walked through the silent, moonlit rooms of our home, my home. The home I had bought, the home Patricia had sneered at, implying it was a monument to my ambition and Daniel's inadequacy. Tonight, it felt like a fortress. Tomorrow, it would be a courtroom. My hands were trembling, and I clasped them together, pressing my knuckles until they turned white. It was a strange, foreign feeling. In the OR, my hands are my partners. They are steady, sure, instruments of precision and healing. But now, they felt like they belonged to someone else. A woman I barely recognized. A woman who had orchestrated the complete and total demolition of another person's life. Was this who I was now? I walked to the window and looked down at the streetlights painting ribbons of gold on the pavement. I thought about the Hippocratic oath I took. First, do no harm. For years, I had applied that to every aspect of my life. I absorbed Patricia's barbs, swallowed her insults, and endured her lies. All to avoid doing harm to Daniel, to our marriage, to the fragile piece of a family I wanted so desperately. But her sickness wasn't something I could cut out with a scalpel. It was a cancer, and it was spreading, threatening to consume everything I loved. I realized then that sometimes the only way to save the patient is to kill the disease. No matter how brutal the procedure, a floorboard creaked behind me. It was Daniel. He came and stood beside me, not touching, just sharing the same patch of moonlight. We didn't speak for a long time. Then, he told me something that shifted the final pieces into place. He said he'd called his mother that afternoon to confirm the meeting. He'd kept his voice cool and professional, simply stating that my lawyer needed her signature on some documents regarding the property. He told me her reaction was unexpected. She hadn't been angry or defiant. She had sounded small. Scared? She'd apparently asked him, in a tiny, wavering voice, if he was going to be there. He'd said yes, that he'd be there with me. And then she'd said something that chilled him to the bone. She told him that she knew she hadn't been the easiest person, but that everything she had ever done, she had done for him. She said she hoped he would remember that. As he recounted her words, a sudden, blinding flash of insight hit me. We had been so focused on her fear of financial ruin, of social humiliation. We'd seen her as a strategist, a con artist, but we had missed the most critical vulnerability of all. Beneath the pride, beneath the lies and the desperation, was a mother terrified of losing her son. Her frantic call wasn't just about the house or the money. It was a last-ditch plea for his loyalty. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for his heart. And in that moment, I saw the flaw in her armor. Her relationship with Daniel wasn't a fortress. It was a dependency. She didn't have his love. She had a hostage. Her power over him was built on a lie that she was his protector, his rock. The moment he chose to stand with me, her entire world would crumble, not because of the money, but because her audience of one would have finally walked out of the theater. Daniel must have seen the change in my eyes. He reached out and finally took my hand. His was warm and steady. He said he was sorry. Sorry for not seeing it sooner. Sorry for letting me go through it alone for so long. He told me he knew tomorrow would be hard, but that we were doing the right thing. He said he finally understood that protecting his mother and enabling her were two very different things. Looking at him then, at the strength that had replaced the grief in his eyes, I felt the last of my fear evaporate. The shaking in my hands stopped. The woman who orchestrated this wasn't a stranger. She was me, the surgeon, the one who identifies the disease, isolates it, and removes it to save the healthy tissue around it. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of preservation. For my husband, for my marriage, for myself. I squeezed his hand back. The sun wasn't up yet, but I could feel the first, faint promise of dawn on the horizon. The quietest night of my life was ending. The battle was hours away. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. Let her come. The stage was set, the evidence was waning, and the truth was a weapon I was finally ready to use. She arrived at precisely 2 o'clock. Punctuality was part of her performance, a sign of a life under control. She wore a cream-colored cashmere sweater set and tailored slacks, an outfit that whispered old money and unshakable class. The scent of her sharp floral perfume invaded my living room before she even stepped fully inside. It was a declaration of war. She was here on my turf, but she was determined to play by her rules. Her eyes flickered around the room, taking in the clean lines, the modern art, the life I had built. I saw a flash of something in them, envy maybe, or resentment, before it was veiled by a cool, polite smile. Then she saw Ruth Martinez, sitting quietly in an armchair, a leather portfolio resting on her lap. Patricia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her gaze darted to Daniel, who stood near the window, his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He just gave a slight nod, a silent confirmation that this was not the friendly family chat she might have been hoping for. The air in the room was cold and thin, like the top of a mountain. Every breath was a conscious effort. I didn't offer her a drink. I didn't ask her to sit. I remained standing in the center of the room, a thick, pristine manila folder in my hands. I let the silence stretch, letting her discomfort build. I watched her composure start to fray at the edges, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her expensive handbag. "Thank you for coming, Patricia," I began, my voice as calm and steady as if I were about to begin a preoperative briefing. "As you know, you are 3 months delinquent on your rent payments for the property at 214 Willow Creek Drive." Her face hardened. She immediately went on the offensive, her voice laced with the tone of a deeply wounded matriarch. She told me she couldn't believe I was being so formal, so cold. She reminded me that we were family, and that families helped each other through tough times. She looked past me, her eyes pleading with Daniel. She asked him if he was really going to let his wife treat his own mother like a common tenant. Daniel didn't move. He didn't even look at her. He just stared out the window. He told her, his voice devoid of any emotion, that he had read the lease agreement she signed. He said he stood with me. The shock on her face was palpable. It was the first time in his life he had ever openly chosen me over her. It was a blow, and I saw her physically recoil. But she recovered quickly, shifting her attack. She started talking about how this was so typical of me that I only understood the world in terms of contracts and money. She hinted that I was the one who had probably forced Daniel into this uncomfortable position. Turning him against his own blood, I let her finish. I let her spin her web of accusations and martyrdom. When she was done, the silence rushed back in to fill the void. I walked to the glass coffee table and opened the folder. I didn't say a word. I just laid the first document on the polished surface. It was a copy of the credit card statement for the Visa opened in Daniel's name, with her address clearly listed as the point of contact. The balance was over $30,000. She scoffed, a brittle, ugly sound. She had a story ready, of course. She claimed Daniel knew all about it. It was a card they used for joint household expenses for her house, an arrangement they'd had for years. She had the audacity to look at her son and tell him he must have forgotten giving her his permission. I said nothing. I just laid down the next statement. A MasterCard. Then an American Express. Then the documents for the $40,000 personal loan. One by one, I placed them on the table, arranging them in a neat, undeniable row. The air left her lungs in a quiet whoosh. The color began to drain from her face. Her eyes darted back and forth between the papers, the numbers blurring into an indictment she couldn't escape. She stammered that it was all a misunderstanding, that Daniel had been having financial trouble and she was just trying to help him, to protect his credit by taking on some burdens for him. The lie was so absurd, so desperate, that it was almost pitiful. "The debt isn't the real issue, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping. "The issue is why you felt you had to do it. The issue is the story you built to cover it up. My trump card was not a financial document. It was a ghost from her past she thought was long buried." I reached back into the folder. My hand was perfectly steady now. I slid a new set of papers across the table. They weren't bank statements. They were photocopies. One was a 15-year-old bankruptcy filing for Reed Construction, her husband's company. The next was a printout of a faded newspaper article. The headline read, "Local investors devastated by Ponzi scheme collapse." And there, halfway down the list of victims who had lost everything, was her name. Patricia made a sound of choked, strangled gasp. Her eyes were glued to the newspaper clipping. Her perfectly made-up face seemed to melt. The mask of the wealthy, respectable widow dissolving to reveal the terrified, desperate woman underneath. This was the secret she had protected for over a decade. This was the shame that had fueled every lie, every manipulation. The Reed family legacy. The inheritance you were so determined to protect me from? It never existed, did it? I said, keeping my voice low and clinical. There was no nest egg. His father's business failed. You lost what was left. For 15 years, you've been living a lie, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. all on your son's credit, while telling him and everyone else that I was the one you had to watch out for. She was silent, utterly, completely silent. She sank onto the edge of the sofa as if her legs could no longer support her. She looked old, frail. You didn't hate me because you thought I wanted your money, I continued. Pressing the final sharpest point, you hated me because my success was a mirror to your failure. You had to make me a gold digger because if you didn't, you would have to admit to yourself and to your son that you were the one who had squandered everything. Tears were now streaming down her face, silent and hot, ruining her makeup. They weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of pure, undiluted humiliation. The performance was over. The stage was gone. The audience knew the truth. Ruth, my lawyer, finally spoke, her voice calm and firm. She spelled out the options, the same ones I had planned. Option 1, a legally binding repayment plan for the back rent would be drafted, and a public written apology would be sent to the family members she had lied to about me, retracting every false story. Option 2, eviction proceedings would begin immediately, and a file containing evidence of aggravated identity theft and financial fraud would be handed over to the district attorney's office. Patricia just stared into space, her world in ashes around her. The choice was hers, but the final blow didn't come from me or my lawyer. It came from Daniel. He finally moved from the window and came to stand beside me. He looked down at his mother, not with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep sadness. He told her, his voice cracking with the weight of his own betrayal, that he could have eventually forgiven the debt. He said he would have helped her if she had just come to him with the truth. But what he couldn't forgive, he said, was that she had used him, that she had tried to systematically destroy his wife, the woman he loved, just to hide her own secrets. He told her he didn't know who she was anymore. That was it. That was the moment she truly broke. The sound that escaped her lips was a raw, animal sound of utter devastation. The money, the house, the reputation, it was all secondary. She had lost him. Silence fell upon the room once more, heavy and absolute. The documents lay on the table, an epitaph for a lifetime of lies. Patricia sat, broken, amidst the wreckage. The air was thick with the unasked question. Her entire future rested on the next word she would utter. In the end, she didn't choose with words. She couldn't. Her voice was gone, lost somewhere in the wreckage of her life. She just gave a single, sharp, defeated nod to my lawyer. Ruth, ever the professional, simply opened her portfolio and produced the settlement documents we had prepared. The pen Patricia used to sign them made a scratching sound in the dead quiet of the room, like a mouse in a wall. It was the only sound. She signed away her pride, her power, and her secrets, one looping signature at a time. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Daniel. When it was done, she stood up, pulled the strap of her handbag onto her shoulder, and walked out the door without a word. The click of the lock behind her was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The aftermath wasn't a victory celebration. There was no champagne, no triumphant embrace. When she was gone, Daniel just sank onto the sofa where she had been sitting and put his head in his hands. I sat beside him, and we just stayed there for a long time, the silence she left behind feeling heavy and contaminated. We hadn't just won a war. We had been forced to burn down a part of our own lives to do it. We were victors standing in a field of ashes, and it felt less like a triumph and more like a tragedy. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Patricia, true to the agreement, began to dismantle her life of lies. I heard from Chloe that her mother received a phone call, a stilted, humiliating apology where Patricia had to admit, in a monotone voice, that the stories she'd told about me were untrue. I can only imagine the conversations she had to have with the rest of the family. The whispers she had started about me were now whispers about her. Her punishment wasn't just financial. It was the complete and utter destruction of the public image she had sacrificed everything to maintain. The check for the back rent and penalties arrived by courier. To pay it, she had to sell the leased luxury car and the jewelry her husband had given her, the last vestiges of the life she pretended to have. The first month's rent check arrived after that, on the first of the month. As stipulated, every month since, like clockwork, it has appeared in our mailbox. Daniel started seeing a therapist. He had to unpack a lifetime of manipulation to grieve the mother he thought he knew. He was rebuilding his own identity, separate from the role of the dutiful, naive son he had been cast in for so long. Our marriage, which had been strained to the breaking point by the weight of my secrets, was finally healing. With all the poison out in the open, we could finally breathe. We talked for hours, raw and honest conversations we should have had years ago. Our relationship became stronger than it had ever been, not because it was perfect, but because it had been tested by the ugliest truths and it had survived. Once a month, as part of her good faith agreement, Patricia invites me to lunch. The first time, it was the most uncomfortable 2 hours of my life. The power dynamic was so completely inverted, it was dizzying. She, who had once held court and judged me from on high, was now making stilted small talk, asking about my work with a new, fearful respect in her eyes. She is a ghost of the woman she once was. The arrogance is gone, replaced by a brittle, hollow shell. She is polite. She is deferential. She treats me with the respect she never would have given freely, but that I had been forced to demand. For a long time, I thought the point of all this was the victory. The irony. The woman who called me a gold digger now lives in my house. The woman who tried to ruin me now pays my mortgage. I thought the satisfaction would come from watching her humbled. But tonight, standing here, telling you all of this, I realize the final twist in this story is an emotional one. A realization that has taken me months to understand. My victory wasn't forcing my mother-in-law to respect me. It wasn't about the money, or the house, or the revenge. The true victory was for the woman I was 3 years ago. The one who cried in the bathroom on her wedding day. The one who let herself be small to keep the peace. I didn't just fight for my husband or my marriage. I fought for her. I fought for the right to take up space in my own life. To have my success be a source of pride, not a weapon to be used against me. The woman I became, the one who hired a pie, who bought debt, who set a trap with the cold precision of a surgeon I used to be afraid of her. I thought the fight had made me hard, had cost me a piece of my soul. But I see now that strength isn't a corruption of my character. It was a part of me that was always there, waiting to be activated. The real win wasn't in defeating Patricia. It was in liberating myself from the fear of her. The house is just bricks and mortar. The rent check is just paper. My real prize is the peace I feel when I walk through my front door. The quiet in my own mind. The knowledge that I will never, ever again allow someone else's insecurity to dictate my worth. This story has been a heavy weight in my heart for so long. Sharing it, saying it all out loud from beginning to end, feels like the final step in closing this chapter of my life. It makes me wonder how many of us are walking around with stories like this, feeling completely alone in our struggles. The truth is, these battles are fought in quiet houses and silent car rides all over the world. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Hearing what city or town you're in is a reminder that we're all connected, a part of a much larger community. Please, let me know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if you want to hear more about finding the strength you never knew you had in the moments you feel most broken, make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss what's next.